The snow came down in quiet spirals, soft as whispers that barely dared touch the earth. It erased the old tracks in the road and softened the sharp edges of the frozen fields, covering everything in a pale, forgiving white. Eleanor Hayes stood at the narrow window of her rented cottage, one hand resting against the glass, the other wrapped tightly around her own wrist, as if holding herself in place. Across the small stretch of land and broken fence that separated their properties, a man knelt beside a little boy in a red coat. He was tying the child's boot with frustrating slowness, his large hands fumbling with laces too thin for fingers made for splitting wood and lifting crates. The boy waited, patient and quiet, looking down at him with trust that throbbed painfully in Eleanor's chest. Those hands! She flinched and pulled her own, away from the window as though they might reach through the frost for her. Men always started like that, careful, gentle, slow, as if they were trying to convince the world and themselves that they posed no threat, as if time and kindness could erase what lived in their bones. She had learned the truth the hard way. Hands that soothed could also strike. Voices that whispered could turn to thunder. Promises could fracture just as easily as glass. The man finished tying the boot and rose. He was tall, too tall, his shoulders broad under a threadbare coat. He brushed the snow from the boy's shoulders before ruffling his hair. The small, familiar gesture made Eleanor's throat tighten. The boy laughed, bright and clear, the sound floating through the cold air to her ears. He didn't deserve what waited in this world. How long before he learned to be afraid, too? "Come on, Jacob," the man said, his voice low, calm. "Let's get your sled." Jacob. The name echoed in her mind. She'd heard it once before, a week ago, drifting through the trees when the boy had called to his father, or uncle, or whoever he was to him. She hadn't cared enough to find out. They moved away from her line of sight, disappearing behind a rise in the snow. The silence returned, thick and heavy. Eleanor exhaled through trembling lips. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, pale, hollow-eyed, a faint shadow of a woman who had once smiled easily. 3 months, she murmured to herself. 3 months since she had arrived in this forgotten corner of Vermont, far from the small town that still whispered her name with pity and speculation, far from the house that still creaked at night like it remembered everything that had happened inside its walls, far from the hands that had once wrapped around her throat and called it love. She'd thought the wilderness would quiet her mind. She had been wrong. The kettle on the small stove began to scream, shrill and insistent, dragging her back into the moment. Eleanor turned away from the window and moved to the kitchen, her movements automatic. She poured the water over dried leaves, watching the steam rise. Every action was deliberate, controlled. She lived that way now, controlled, careful, predictable. A knock echoed through the tiny house. The cup slipped from her fingers and shattered at her feet. For a moment she simply stood there, frozen, heart thrashing against her ribs. No one knocked on her door. She had made sure of that. She didn't walk into town unless it was necessary. She didn't speak to strangers. She didn't invite conversation. The knock came again. Softer this time, almost hesitant. "Ma'am?" A child's voice. Eleanor swallowed hard and forced her racing feet to move. She didn't open the door right away. Through the small, curved glass, she saw a shock of messy, dark hair, a red knit hat pulled down too far over wide eyes. "I'm not here," she almost said. Instead, she unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. "Yes?" Jacob stood on her step, his cheeks flushed from the cold, his breath puffing in small white clouds. He shifted his weight, holding out a folded piece of paper in both hands. "My dad said to give you this." A defensive wall slammed up inside her chest. "I don't know your father." He nodded quickly. "He knows. He said you're Mrs. Hayes and that it's almost Christmas." The word hung in the cold air like a fragile ornament. "My dad made too much stew again," he added shyly. "He always does that. He says no one should be alone at Christmas. He said you could come over tomorrow, if you wanted to." Eleanor stared at the paper as if it might explode. "I don't eat with strangers," she said quietly. "He says he won't be a stranger if you come," Jacob replied, his brow furrowing in serious thought. "He's not a bad man. He's just quiet, like you." Those simple words pierced deeper than she expected. Quiet. Like you. He wasn't afraid of her. She didn't reach for the note. You should go home, Jacob. His face fell, but he didn't step away immediately. He told me that you might say no, the boy said softly. He said that's okay. He said I should still tell you the door will be open. And if not tomorrow, then maybe a different day. For the holidays. He placed the folded note on her doorstep carefully, as if it were something precious, then turned and trudged away through the snow. Eleanor watched him disappear, her eyes stinging in a way the cold had nothing to do with. She didn't pick up the paper right away. It lay there on the wood like an accusation. That night, sleep refused to come. Memories crept in with the silence, the sharp slam of doors, the pressure of fingers, the way her voice had dissolved into apologies that were never enough. She shifted under her quilt, staring up at the ceiling beams that loomed above like ribs of a broken chest. A man who makes too much stew. A boy who trusts too easily. A door left open. You could come over tomorrow. Her mind replayed the image of the man in the snow, the way he brushed flakes from the boy's shoulders, the careful gentleness of his touch. Hands that do not hurt, said a voice deep inside. Liar, another part of her snapped back. In the early hours of the morning, long before the sun painted the world with color, Eleanor rose from her bed. She lit the small oil lamp and moved quietly around the room. Her eyes fell on a small wooden box tucked away in a cupboard. Inside, wrapped in faded fabric, was a simple silver bracelet. It had belonged to her mother, something small, something unbroken by time. Without allowing herself to think too long, she placed it in her pocket. You're only going to return the invitation, she whispered to the empty room. That's all? The path to the neighboring property was half hidden by fresh snow. Each step forward was a war between her feet and her fear. The house stood sturdy and dark against the white earth, smoke curling from its chimney. As she approached, she noticed small, clumsy boot prints surrounding it. Playful circles, evidence of a child's world. She stopped at the foot of the steps. Her heart was screaming now. Before she could knock, the door opened. He stood there, taller than she remembered, his face worn but kind. Lines around his eyes deepened when he saw her, surprise flickering before settling into cautious relief. Mrs. Hayes, he said gently, I wasn't sure you'd come. I came to return this. She held out the invitation without stepping forward. I appreciate the thought, but I don't join people for holidays. He didn't move to take it right away. That's fair, he replied, but you can keep it, in case you change your mind. I won't. That's okay too. Silence stretched between them. It was not uncomfortable, only heavy with things unsaid. Jacob's voice rang from somewhere inside. Dad, is it her? She's here, bud. Footsteps pounded toward the door, and suddenly the boy stood there, sheer delight on his face. You came, he said, eyes lighting up. I told him you would. I came to say thank you and goodbye, she corrected quietly. He didn't hear the goodbye. He was too busy smiling. My dad makes the best bread on Christmas morning, he announced proudly. He said if you don't like it, he'll make something else. He can make pancakes too, or eggs, or just tea. Her gaze flicked briefly to the man. He talks too much, doesn't he? The man murmured. No, Eleanor said before she could stop herself. He just believes in things. Jacob leaned closer to her. He believes in you, he whispered, as if sharing a sacred secret. The man's jaw tightened, emotion held carefully in control. Jacob, go see if the kettle is whistling. Yes, sir. The boy disappeared, leaving an echo of warmth in his absence. I don't want to disrupt your life, Eleanor said. I came here to be alone. I know what that's like, he replied quietly. But sometimes alone isn't what heals us. She searched his face for any trace of force, any hint of hidden cruelty. There was none, only a tired man standing in a doorway, offering space rather than claiming it. Behind them, the house glowed with warmth. Outside, the world remained cold. For the first time in 3 months, Eleanor hesitated not because of fear, but because of a small, unfamiliar longing. I won't stay long, she said at last. His lips curved into a soft smile. You can leave whenever you want. No one here will stop you. And somehow, she believed him. She stepped inside. The warmth of the house startled her more than the knock on her door had. It settled over her skin, slipped beneath the layers of wool and memories she had wrapped around herself. The scent of bread and herbs hung in the air, mingling with faint traces of pine and smoke. It was the smell of something familiar she had almost forgotten. Home. Jacob stood near the kitchen table now, watching the kettle like it might perform a magic trick just for him. He turned when he saw her step inside, his grin bright enough to compete with the little lamp on the wall. "You really came in," he said, awe in every syllable. "I said I might," she replied, her voice softer than intended. "You're braver than most," the man said quietly as he closed the door behind her. She stiffened slightly, but he simply moved away, giving her the space he seemed to instinctively understand she needed. "My name is Samuel," he added. "I should have told you that before." "Eleanor," she said, though he'd already known it. "Yes," he smiled. "It suits you." He pulled a chair back for her but did not insist. She hesitated before sitting, as though even furniture required permission in this strange, gentle place. Jacob bounded over with a cup in his small hands, concentrating hard not to spill its contents. "It's tea," he said proudly. "Dad says it's the good kind." She accepted it carefully. Their fingers almost touched, and when they brushed, the familiar jolt of panic soared up her spine. She pulled away too fast, the tea trembling in the cup. Samuel turned his back immediately, busying himself with slicing bread. He said nothing, asked nothing. The moment drifted away unacknowledged. That quiet compassion unsettled her. They talked little as she sipped the tea. Mostly Jacob filled the silence with stories about school, about the fox he'd seen in the woods, about how he thought snowflakes were secret messages from the sky. Samuel glanced at her occasionally, small checks rather than stares, like he was making sure she hadn't disappeared. "I didn't mean to frighten you the other day," he said eventually. "When I picked him up, I know how hands can look. From a distance." Her fingers tightened around the porcelain. "You didn't frighten me." That was a lie. They both knew it. He let it live because sometimes lies were safer than truth. "You live alone here?" she asked, looking around more carefully now. The modest furniture, the handmade shelves, the carved toys, evidence of a life built with effort, not violence. "Since he was 5, Samuel replied. "His mother passed in the winter. Same kind of cold as this one, only much darker." Her chest ached for the boy beside her, now idly tracing patterns on the table with his finger. "She would have liked you," he continued. "She believed people only looked hard on the outside because the world hadn't been kind enough yet." Eleanor swallowed, unable to respond. Time passed differently inside that house, thicker, softer. She didn't notice how long she had been there until the shadows began to stretch across the wooden floor. "I should go," she said, rising. Jacob's face collapsed instantly. "Already? I came to return your invitation, remember?" she offered with a sad half-smile. Samuel nodded but didn't hide the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "You're always welcome," he said, "no matter the day." She walked to the door. Her hand hovered over the knob. Something inside her resisted the cold waiting outside. "You don't have to be afraid here," he added, not pleading, only stating what he felt was true. She closed her eyes briefly, then stepped out into the snow. She returned the next morning without planning to. A small tin of jam sat in her hand, homemade, the last of what little she had left from autumn berries. She told herself it was only fair, a thank-you offering. Nothing more. Jacob opened the door this time, nearly vibrating with joy. "You came back!" he cried. "I told you I might," she said, almost amused. Samuel appeared behind him, surprise giving way to something warm and unspoken. "Good morning, Eleanor." And that was it. No questions, no pressure, just a simple, powerful acknowledgement. From that morning on, the pattern was formed. She helped Jacob with his reading. Samuel taught her how to mend fishing nets, how to sharpen a blade without fear of it, how to split wood in a way that conserved strength instead of forcing it. Their hands worked near each other, sometimes close enough to feel warmth, but never too close to threaten. Her fear did not vanish overnight. It whispered at her when Samuel stood too near, when his voice dropped too low, when his hands flexed as he worked. But every time he moved slower, careful, patient, as if healing was something sacred. One afternoon, as snow poured from the sky like spilled feathers, Jacob slipped on the icy porch, His small body crashed down with a brittle cry. Eleanor gasped and rushed forward, but Samuel reached him first. "Those same hands again!" She froze, watching. He lifted the boy with such care, such precision, as if Jacob were made of glass. He murmured soothing words, brushed hair from his face, checked his limbs, his forehead, his wrists. "It's okay," he whispered. "Papa's here. I've got you." Tears burned Eleanor's eyes before she realized they'd formed. He wasn't made to hurt. He was made to protect. When he finally looked at her, his eyes searched hers quietly, as if waiting for her to see him clearly at last. And she did. In that moment, something broke open inside her, and something else began to heal. That evening, when she stood to leave once more, her steps slow and reluctant, Samuel spoke gently behind her. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. "I don't know how to be anything else," she whispered back. "Then learn here," he replied softly. "With us." Outside, soft snow erased the path between them. Inside, a light burned steady. The storm arrived without warning. Snow that had once fallen in slow, harmless ribbons now blasted sideways like shards of glass. The sky swallowed all color, swallowing even time itself. The narrow valley where Eleanor, Samuel, and Jacob lived became nothing more than a white void, as if the world beyond them had ceased to exist. Eleanor stood at her window, watching the winds tear at the frozen earth, and felt an old familiar panic claw its way up her throat. Storms used to mean broken things, crying walls, slamming doors, raised voices that rattled bones. Storms always brought out the worst in him. Samuel had asked her to stay the night for the first time. "Roads aren't safe," he'd said, "and the drifts out there can swallow a woman whole." Normally, she would have refused. Pride and fear would have forced her back to her empty, frozen home. But Jacob had looked at her with wide, pleading eyes. "Please," he'd whispered. "The wind makes bad dreams for me." So she stayed. She now sat at the wooden table, the fire cracking behind her, a blanket draped carefully around her shoulders. Samuel had placed it there without touching her. Just set it down, stepped away. Jacob slept on a small mattress near the hearth, his features finely relaxed in the quiet warmth. The storm howled outside like some furious beast trying to break in. But inside, there was only the soft flicker of flame and the steady sound of Samuel's breathing across the room. He sat on the other chair, sharpening a blade by habit, though he clearly didn't need to. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, never wasting emotion. "You're not afraid of storms," she said suddenly, breaking the calm. He looked up at her. "I've seen worse than storms." "So have I." Their eyes met across the room, and the silence between them throbbed with things that had never been named, things too painful to speak, too heavy to deny. "You don't have to talk about it," he added gently. "I didn't say I wouldn't," she whispered. And for the first time since she had arrived in the valley, Eleanor began to speak. She spoke of cracked teacups and shattered windows, of apologies bruised into her skin, of nights spent counting ceiling beams while her body trembled, from what love had turned into. She spoke of the way fear rooted into her mind and made every man's touch feel like a threat crawling under her skin. Samuel listened. Not a single flinch, not a single interruption, only understanding in the steady quiet of his gaze. "I thought if I came far enough, I'd stop seeing his face," she said, her voice hollow. "But all I did was change the shape of the walls imprisoning me." "You don't live in a cage anymore," he replied. "You're just still holding the door shut." The truth of his words hit deeper than anything she'd heard in years. Outside, the storm raged harder. The windows rattled under its force. Jacob whimpered in his sleep. Samuel rose at once, not rushed, just instinctive. He crossed the room and knelt by the boy, placing a hand gently on his back. "It's all right, son," he whispered. "I'm right here." Eleanor watched him, the same hands she had so badly misunderstood moving with absolute devotion. There was no anger in them, no sharpness, only love that had hardened into strength. In that moment her last illusion shattered. When he returned to his chair, she didn't flinch this time when he sat closer to the fire where she was. "How did you not let grief make you cruel?" she asked. "Because he still needed me," Samuel said, glancing toward Jacob. "And because cruelty is a choice, one I vowed never to make." A long pause followed. Snow struck the windows like thrown salt. Slowly, hesitant as if approaching deep water, Eleanor extended her hand. Not away from him. Toward him. Samuel froze, his eyes lowered to her hand in disbelief. This time he didn't reach first. He waited. Always, he waited. "You once said courage isn't the absence of fear," she murmured. "It's moving anyway." "Then you are the bravest woman I've ever known," he whispered. His fingers closed around hers. Warm, steady, gentle. Her breath came out in a trembling exhale. Nothing inside her shattered. Nothing hurt. Only warmth. She squeezed his hand, and for the first time in years, she felt safe within touch. The storm raged through the night, but its power faded by morning. Sunlight spilled through the window, pooling gold across the wooden floorboards. Eleanor stirred, realizing she had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting against the table. Her hand was still in Samuel's. He had not moved. Jacob sat up near the fire, blinking in confusion. Then he saw them. His face lit with a slow, sleepy smile. "You stayed," he whispered. "I knew you would." Eleanor's heart did something strange. Something beautiful. Samuel released her hand carefully, as if to ask permission, even after permission had already been given. "You don't have to go today," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, and for the first time, she didn't want to. The storm had cleared the world clean, and in the quiet that followed, Eleanor realized the greatest truth of all. She had not run away to this valley. She had been led here. That morning, the world looked as if it had been born again. Snow lay unbroken beyond the cabin, pure and untouched, the sky a pale blue stretching endlessly overhead. Light filtered through the frost-dusted windows, soft and golden, casting warmth across the rough wooden floor and the deep lines in Samuel's face. Eleanor stood at the window now, the same place where fear had once gripped her like a vice. Only this time her hands rested calmly at her sides. The tremble was gone. Behind her, Jacob laughed at something Samuel had said. The sound filled the cabin, bright and alive. "I want to go outside," he announced. "I bet the world looks different today." "It always looks different after a storm," Samuel replied. Eleanor turned, bringing a coat around her shoulders. "Then let's see it." They stepped out together, the fresh snow crunching beneath their feet. The air was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and silence. The trees stood tall and proud, and not a single sound of the past seemed able to reach her here. Jacob raced ahead, arms stretched wide. "It's like everything's forgiven," he cried. Samuel watched him fondly. "That's what snow does," he said. "It covers what hurt and gives the world another chance." Eleanor looked at him. His face held no expectation, no pressure, only understanding. "I used to think it covered the truth," she said softly. "Now I think it reveals it." He met her eyes, the unspoken feelings between them as clear as the winter light. Some truths just need quiet to be heard. They walked through the clearing together. Jacob collected small branches, insisting on building the most crooked snowman the world had ever seen. Eleanor found herself laughing when he placed a hat too large onto its misshapen head. Samuel's laughter joined hers, and with it, the last of her walls finally crumbled. Later, inside the warm cabin, they shared a meal that tasted richer than any feast she remembered. Bread fresh from the oven, jam melted into golden pools, eggs cooked slow and tender. Simple things, beautiful because they were shared. When the dishes were done, Jacob curled up near the fire with his book. Samuel sat beside Eleanor at the table, the same table where she had first sat in doubt. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. She didn't hesitate. "No," she said, "for the first time in years. I feel like I've arrived." Something softened in his eyes. "I would never trap you here," he said. "Even if I wanted you to stay." "You wouldn't have to trap me," she replied, "because I'd be choosing it." Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't heavy with fear. It was full, complete. Samuel reached for her hand again, slower than ever, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. His touch had become something sacred. Not a memory of pain, but a promise of gentleness. Outside, the snow continued to fall lightly, a hush across the earth. Inside, a different season had arrived entirely. Later, as twilight pulled its indigo veil across the land, Jacob stirred by the hearth half asleep. "Are you going to leave again tomorrow?" he asked drowsily. Eleanor looked at him. At this boy who had never doubted her goodness, who had seen her before she had learned to see herself again. She crossed the room and knelt beside him. "No, sweetheart," she said, brushing back his hair. "I think I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." He sighed contentedly and drifted back to sleep. Samuel stood behind her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You really mean that?" She rose slowly and faced him, their foreheads nearly touching, the air between them warm with truth. "Yes," she said. "I've spent too long running from hands that hurt. I don't want to run from hands that heal." Outside, the stars appeared one by one, bright against the velvet sky. Inside, a family took its first true breath. 3 souls bruised by life, brought together not by chance, but by quiet mercy. The world outside remained winter. But within that small cabin, in the glow of a single lamp, and the warmth of 3 hearts finally at peace, spring had already begun. And for Eleanor Hayes, the greatest truth of all was now undeniable. She had not escaped her past. She had found her future.